Back in November, I had the fantastic opportunity to go to a number of biblical conferences in San Diego. While I was there, I had a chance to spend some time with my dear friend, Carmen Imes. She's an Old Testament professor up at Prairie College up in Canada. Carmen has a new book coming out on December 10th. It's called Bearing God's Name, Why Sinai Still Matters. And as you can probably guess, with it having an Old Testament theme, it's something that I'm really excited about. Carmen was gracious enough to share her book with me, and I've been reading through it and learning so much. But in addition to sharing that book, she was willing to sit down for a brief interview. So instead of my normal blog post this week, I want to share with you that interview. We've got the video, so you'll get to see Carmen and listen in on the conversation we had. But above all, I'd just really like to encourage you, get this book. It is a fantastic resource that will really help you to better understand what it means to bear God's name and really understand also why the Old Testament still matters today. Okay, Carmen, thank you for joining me today. I'm really excited to have you here, and I'm excited to have you share a little bit about your new book with my readers. I have been thoroughly enjoying it. The title of your book is Bearing God's Name, Why Sinai Still Matters. So to me, inherent in that title is this idea that the Old Testament broadly still matters for Christians today. So can you tell us a little bit about how you came to appreciate the importance of the Old Testament for today's Christians?
Yeah, the story starts a long time ago. I remember loving the Old Testament as a kid, and I actually really loved the book of Isaiah when I was a kid, which is probably not totally normal. But I remember just loving how powerful it was, how much depth it had. Then I got to Bible college. I went to Multnomah Bible College, now Multnomah University, and I remember just having my boxes blown wide open by my Bible professors. And as they taught me the Old Testament, then I would go back to the New Testament and see it with new eyes, because I would see how much was there that I hadn't understood before. And then I would see the New Testament come alive in new ways. So I think that's when I started to realize if we don't have a grasp on the Old Testament, we are going to read the New Testament flatly in ways that actually distort its message. And so the church needs to recover the Old Testament. So already in college, I was thinking about this issue and thinking, how can we help the church to reconnect?
Okay, that's part of what took me down that road as well, because I feel like the church so often, we get these token mentions of the Old Testament, or they'll, in our sermons, they'll just gesture to it, but without that deeper understanding, we really can't understand Jesus and who he is. And so in addition to being an author and having this book come out, you are an Old Testament professor. What is your favorite thing about teaching the Old Testament? I'm guessing this is going to tie some into what you were just talking about. But
yeah, I love teaching the Old Testament in part because most students walk into the classroom with a very fuzzy grasp of the Old Testament. So there was a time when I was debating, should I become a New Testament scholar or an Old Testament scholar? And that's when I realized there's a bigger knowledge gap with the Old Testament than there is with the New Testament. And if I could help people grasp the Old Testament, then I'm actually helping them in both Testaments. So I love having students who come in and they either think, A, I've been to Sunday school my whole life, I know these stories, or B, I have no idea what's in the Old Testament. And both of those groups, I feel like, undergo a total transformation as they sit in an Old Testament class, because the group that thought they knew the Old Testament discovers, oh, there's a lot of stuff here I never heard in Sunday school, and I don't know what to do with it. And then the second group starts to discover how much riches there are in the Old Testament that they've been missing out on. So my goal, and what I see happen over and over again, is for both of those groups to kind of come to the place where they realize how much they don't know, and they realize the value of studying it, and begin to get the tools for doing that. It's just fun to see that happen over and over again every semester.
Yeah, and trying to balance, I think you hit on two things that I just love, is that we want to get across the content, we want you to understand that, but also giving tools to students or to people in the church to do some of the work themselves.
Yeah.
So if you looked then at these classes, what that you're teaching an Old Testament survey or a specific class, say on Torah, or even your book, if you could get one thing across to your students or to your audience, what would it be?
I think that one thing I want them to walk away with is the realization that it's worth the effort to understand the Old Testament. That when we take time to read it in its historical, literary, and theological context, that it comes alive and it's actually quite relevant for Christians today. A lot of people think, that stuff's old, it's done. If we just focus on the New Testament, we'll get what we need. But if we take the time with the Old Testament, it's so rich and so worth it.
Okay. So is that part of what inspired this project, or was it something else?
Yeah, that's definitely a big piece of what inspired this book. As I was working on my doctorate at Wheaton College under Dan Block, I became increasingly convinced that the stuff that I was working on, the church needed to hear. I was learning and discovering so much about the Old Testament that I had never seen before, even though I'd spent my whole life in the church, gone to Sunday school every week, and gone through Bible college. I was still discovering new things that I felt like the church needed to hear. Yeah. And frankly, the church at large is not going to read my published dissertation. It's much too boring. There's a lot of, Greek and Hebrew and lots of footnotes and lots of technical language. And so all the way through my doctorate, I had in mind the goal of rewriting it and representing it in a way that the church could read and appreciate.
Yeah. And it's so important. That's one of the things that's just really hit me, is that all this academic work doesn't really matter if it doesn't get to the church and if we don't use it to serve the church. And that's what it really all comes down to. So,
and I would say not every scholar is called to bridge that gap. Like there are just some pure academics who are doing important work. And I wouldn't say that every academic needs to be translating everything they do for the church, but I do feel a personal sense of calling to do that. And it was a privilege to write this book. I'm so glad that IVP gave me the opportunity.
Yeah, I'm excited that you did too. And I absolutely agree. That work can serve the church, even if it's not being taken directly to the church, because sometimes that work serves our pastors. Our pastors will access that research or the commentaries, and then they use it. So I think that it can, I agree with you that not everybody is called to bridge that gap, but I think you definitely are one of the people who's doing that, and I know that I'm appreciative of that. So could you briefly describe this book for those who have not been exposed to it before, maybe a quick version of an elevator pitch, or if you want to get into a little bit more, that's fine. Just give us a brief overview.
Yeah. So here it is, if you can see it on your screen, if it's not backwards for you. Bearing God's Name, Why Sinai Still Matters is my attempt to help Christians see the value of the Old Testament, particularly at Sinai. Sinai is an important moment in Israel's development as a nation, and it's at Sinai that they enter into a covenant with Yahweh, that he places his name on them so that they'll be his representatives among the nations, showing the nations what he's like. And so my contention is that if we skip Sinai, if we unhitch from the Old Testament, we miss out on a full understanding of our vocation as Christians and our identity. So who am I, and what does God have for me to do in the world? If we want to answer those two questions, we really need to start at Sinai. We need to go back and see, what is God doing with his people there? How is he equipping them to display his character to a watching world?
Okay, that's great. So the account about Sinai happens in Exodus, and I understand that you're going to be writing an Exodus commentary as well?
I am.
Okay, and that's
a longer, 5-year project that I'm only just beginning.
Oh yeah, well, it'll take some time, but is it going to be aimed at pastors, or is it going to be aimed at a lay audience? Who's the audience for that commentary?
They've told me to aim at pastors and graduate students, and I would put in that category as well, really interested lay people. Okay. It'll be more technical than this book is, but it will be something that students can read and appreciate as well. I know that my undergrad students are looking in commentaries all the time in
Right.
this particular series. So even if it's more academic, they should be able to still glean from it.
Okay. So this project, as you've kind of mentioned, has made some of your detailed academic work accessible to everyday people in the church. Did you learn anything new about your topic as you were working on it, or was it just kind of a process of bringing it all together?
Yeah, mostly it was a process of bringing it all together.
Okay.
If you've walked a mile in my shoes, you'll be able to see, as you work your way through the book, evidence of all these different pieces of my own education. So my master's thesis makes an appearance. My dissertation takes a larger role, but also papers that I wrote for different classes that I took reappear as chapter sections where I just kind of give the heart of what I've learned. So mostly the research was done for me before I started writing this one. But there is, it's a good question. There was something that really struck me in a new way that I hadn't thought about before. And that is the discussion of Elijah in chapter 7. I was looking at where else is Sinai mentioned in the Bible and why. Because it's interesting, Israel has such a formative experience at Sinai, but then they don't actually make pilgrimages back to Sinai on a regular basis to remember the covenant.
Right.
The sort of center of gravity shifts from Sinai to Mount Zion, where Jerusalem is, later in Israel's history. So I was reflecting on where else do we hear about Sinai and why, and came across the Elijah story where he's on the run from Queen Jezebel and goes out into the desert and wants to die. But then God revives him and he ends up traveling to Sinai. And so for the first time I was reflecting on why. Why does he go there?
Right.
And it seems to me that from his vantage point, the covenant has come to a screeching halt, that it's come to an end. He's living in a kingdom where the king is dedicated to the worship of Baal, and the king's wife is killing all the prophets she can find of Yahweh. And so he feels like he's the only one left. And so I wonder, I say on page 120, from Elijah's prophetic vantage point, the covenant seems to have come to an end. Has he come to Mount Sinai to begin the covenant again? It would be an appropriate place to do so. Like Moses, he stays in a cave on the mountain. Like Moses, he converses with Yahweh. Like Moses, Elijah has the opportunity to see Yahweh pass by. So he's showing himself to be a model prophet in the tradition of Moses. And it seems to me like he's wanting a do-over, like, God, can we start fresh? Because clearly this has all kind of collapsed in his own context. So that was one tidbit that I gained, and also as that connects to the Mount of Transfiguration in the New Testament, where you get Moses and Elijah, the two prophets who went to Sinai, are now there with Jesus. And so just reflecting on that made those passages come alive in a new way for me.
Yeah, and it might be interesting to consider because Moses, at one point on Sinai, the people have broken the covenant while he is receiving the tablets, and Yahweh, or God, Yahweh being God's personal name,
right?
God says, "I'm going to start over with you," and Moses says, "Oh, no, I don't think so." Not exactly the way he said it, but. And so it'd be interesting maybe to consider that too, this idea of starting over. And so,
and what is the prophet's role when God wants to start over, or when does the prophet want to start over?
Right. So that might be interesting to investigate. So now you've got my mind turning on different topics. But I think you are in a much better place to tackle this, since Exodus is not my area of expertise. So, what were you most surprised by during the whole research process? Not just bringing it together in this book, but in the whole arc. You talked about your papers and your thesis and your dissertation. What was the most surprising to you?
Yeah, so I started out with this idea that was given to me by my mentor, Daniel Block, that the command not to take the Lord's name in vain had been mistranslated and misunderstood.
Okay.
And that we should think of it as, we should translate it as, you shall not bear the name of Yahweh your God in vain.
Okay.
And it connects to this idea of the people of God bearing his name. He's placed his name on them basically to say, you're mine, you belong to me.
Okay.
And so now you're supposed to, the command is telling them not to go out and live like their pagan neighbors, but to live as though they belong to Yahweh. So that idea I was sold on. I thought that's really cool. What was most surprising to me was as I read through the rest of the Bible to see how many places, how many other passages refer back to this same theme or carry forward the same theme of the people of God bearing his name. And it was surprising to me that I'd never seen it before. It wasn't until I sort of figured out that verse that then all of a sudden it was like the prism through which I could see so many other passages. So you have, for example, in Psalm 23, he leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Psalm 23 is super common. Most people who don't even read the Old Testament are familiar with it. But I had never stopped to ask myself, what does it mean? He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake.
Yeah.
What has his name got to do with my path that I'm walking?
Yeah.
And that's just another example among dozens I could give you where the idea is that our obedience is a reflection on God's reputation. If we're the people who bear his name, then if we don't walk a path of righteousness, his reputation suffers because we represent him. And so I think the biggest surprise to me was just how completely widespread it is from Genesis to Revelation.
Wow. It's so cool that sometimes you don't realize something is there and then one piece will come together. For example, here, bearing the name and the idea that we represent God. And then all of a sudden, all these other pieces fall into place. And I love when that happens.
Yeah, really fun. And this book was so fun because the dissertation didn't allow me to trace that theme all the way through the Bible. I had to be like laser focused on that passage and its context and its potential parallels. And so I had at one point written a chapter that traced the theme through the whole Bible. And then my mentors told me, Carmen, save this one for the church. This doesn't belong in your dissertation. And so I did save it, and it became this book.
Oh, that's fantastic. I love that. So one of the things that we always try to do on this blog is to consider how our understanding of God and our relationship is affected by what we're learning. And so you kind of started alluding to that, but would you mind sharing with us how this project or the academic work leading up to it has impacted your personal walk with Jesus?
Mm-hmm. I think one of the biggest takeaways from the theme that I've locked into is that our faith is not just private and personal. It's not just about me and Jesus or where am I going to go when I die, but that my entire life is on display, and that's part of who God's called me to be, is to be somebody who represents him. So, I'd always been interested in missions and thinking about evangelism, and so that wasn't a totally new concept, but just to see how central it is to our core identity as believers, that was a big takeaway. I think personally, just the process of slogging through a dissertation, 5 years worth of really detailed work, as you know, it's draining, grueling. You come up against roadblocks and setbacks and you think, I don't know if this is ever going to get done. And when it gets finished, I don't know if it will be any good at all.
Yes.
These are kind of the normal psychological seasons of a PhD soul. And so I feel like what's been a real gift to me in this process of writing this book is seeing it finally come together and bear fruit for the church. And it's made it worth it, all these years of slogging through difficult books. There was one point at which I had to read a 300-page German monograph on my passage, and I needed to read the whole thing, and I needed to understand it thoroughly in order to finish my dissertation. And that was just like, oh, how am I ever going to do this? So to see this in print and to be getting messages from people who are reading it and appreciating it has just been a huge gift to me, redeeming those years of sweat and tears.
Yes. May not have been the focus at the time, but I will redeem the years that the locusts have eaten.
Exactly. There were lots of locusts.
Yeah.
is redeeming. I mean, I got an email yesterday from a guy in Michigan who found my book at Baker Book House and bought it at the end of November, and he sat down and read it through in a single day. And he's just gushing about how helpful it was. He told me it moved him to tears multiple times, and that he has been telling everybody he knows about the book. And he was kind enough to take the time to write me and let me know how it impacted him. So that's just really a gift.
Yeah, what a gift. That is a gift, and it's amazing when we see God work that way. We see how what he's teaching us affects how we walk and how we live our lives, how we bear his name, as you've talked about. But then on top of that, he gives us a gift of showing us sometimes how the way that we're bearing his name blesses or encourages others, and that's an incredible gift. So
it is.
Yeah, well, I know you have students that you've got to get back to and classes you've got to teach, but I just want to thank you for taking the time to talk with us and tell us a bit about your book. It releases, I believe, on December 10th officially.
That's right. Okay. That's right. IVP is already shipping it. They've been shipping it for a month already, so there's lots of people out there who have their hands on a copy. Okay. But official release is December 10th.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, and for anyone who's listening, I really encourage you to read the book. I've been going through it, and I absolutely love it. I'm learning new things in every chapter, and it's just really accessible and easy to read. So you don't have to have a theology degree or a Bible degree or know crazy languages to do this. You can really get through it just for everyday people.
Thank you. I'm so glad you're finding it useful and helping me spread the word about it.
Absolutely.
It's been a fun project.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Carmen. I appreciate your time.
All right. Thank you.